The thunder of engines echoed across the European continent in the spring of 1940, a sound that heralded not just war, but a revolution in military science. At the spearhead of this revolution was a man whose vision would redefine combat for generations, General Heinz Guderian. To comprehend the profound tragedy of the general whose warnings were ignored, one must first appreciate the unparalleled genius of the architect who conceived the very mechanism of German victory. Heinz Guderian was not a creature of the Nazi Party. He was a product of the Great War's grim stalemate. Born in 1888 in Kulm, he served as a communications officer and junior staff officer during the First World War, an experience that imprinted upon him the utter futility of static trench warfare. While others saw the tank as a minor support weapon, Guderian perceived its latent potential to restore mobility, decisiveness, and strategic depth to the battlefield. During the interwar years, a period of intellectual ferment within the Reichswehr, Guderian emerged as a voracious student and a formidable evangelist for a new form of warfare. He immersed himself in the works of visionary British theorists like J.F.C. Fuller and B.H. Liddell Hart, but he did more than just adopt their ideas. He synthesized and Germanized them, creating a coherent and devastating doctrine. He fought tirelessly against the conservative old guard of the German General Staff, who viewed the tank as merely an infantry support vehicle. Guderian argued for the opposite. The tank must be the central, decisive weapon, organized into independent, combined arms panzer divisions. He became the fiery apostle of Bewegungskrieg, war of movement, and his sermons gave birth to the term that would echo through history, Blitzkrieg. The core of Guderian's revolutionary doctrine was the concept of the Schwerpunkt, the point of maximum effort. This was not about brute force along a broad front, but the surgical application of overwhelming power at a single critical point. This force was a perfectly integrated team. Panzer divisions formed the spearhead, followed closely by motorized infantry, combat engineers, and crucially, supported by the Luftwaffe, particularly the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber, which acted as flying precision artillery. This combined arms fist would smash through the enemy's tactical defenses, but its true purpose was strategic. It would then race deep into the enemy's rear areas, shattering command and control centers, seizing key bridges and supply depots, and spreading what Guderian termed Funkstörung, a state of command paralysis and chaos. The goal was not to defeat the enemy army unit by unit, but to sever its nervous system, rendering it incapable of coordinated action. His radical theories found an unlikely and powerful patron in Adolf Hitler. The Nazi dictator, a former corporal with a visceral understanding of dramatic effect, was instinctively drawn to concepts that promised swift, war-winning victories. He saw in Guderian's panzers the perfect instrument for his political and expansionist ambitions. During a live demonstration of a panzer division's capabilities in 1935, Hitler was captivated, reportedly turning to Guderian and exclaiming, "That is what I need. That is what I want." This alliance between the military technocrat and the political demagogue would yield stunning, if fleeting, success. The proof of Guderian's doctrine was written in lightning across the maps of Europe. In September 1939, his 19th Panzer Corps was the tip of the spear in the invasion of Poland, demonstrating the brutal efficiency of the Blitzkrieg. But the true masterpiece was the campaign in the West in 1940. While cautious superiors hesitated, Guderian audaciously pushed his tanks through the impassable Ardennes forest, crossed the Meuse at Sedan, and shattered the French defensive line. Then came his most decisive and insubordinate act, the race to the sea. Defying explicit orders from a nervous high command to halt and consolidate, he drove his exhausted but triumphant divisions relentlessly westward, reaching the English Channel and effectively cutting off the entire British expeditionary force and the finest French armies, leading to the miracle of Dunkirk and the total collapse of French resistance. In that moment, Heinz Guderian stood at the zenith of his influence and power. He was the prophet vindicated, the architect of a new era of warfare. Hitler viewed him as a magician who could conjure impossible victories. Yet, this very triumph sowed the seeds of a far greater tragedy. The man who had mastered the war of movement was destined to be shackled by a leader who would forget how to listen, in a conflict that was destined to become a static, brutal war of attrition on a scale the world had never seen. By the winter of 1941, the lightning advances of the Blitzkrieg had frozen solid in the unimaginable cold of the Russian front. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, had begun with the now familiar, breathtaking penetrations. Guderian's Panzer Group II had been at the forefront of the drive toward Moscow, but the vastness of Russia, the dogged resilience of the Red Army, and the arrival of General Winter brought the German war machine to a grinding, bloody halt at the gates of the Soviet capital. The Blitzkrieg had failed to deliver its knockout blow. The war of movement was over, replaced by a brutal war of endurance. In this new, grim reality, Heinz Guderian found himself cast into the wilderness. In December 1941, after a bitter dispute with his superior over a necessary tactical withdrawal to save his decimated troops from destruction, he was summarily relieved of his command by Hitler. For over a year, the father of the Panzer forces was a general without an army, a Cassandra forced to watch from the sidelines as the tide of war turned irrevocably against Germany. The catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad in early 1943 served as a temporary, brutal dose of reality for Hitler. Desperate to rebuild his shattered armoured forces, he recalled Guderian in February 1943, appointing him to the powerful new position of Inspector General of Panzer Troops. Guderian returned with his characteristic vigour and unflinching honesty. His mandate was monumental: to rationalise Germany's chaotic and competing tank production lines, oversee the design and deployment of new models like the Panther and Tiger, and train a new generation of Panzer crews to replace the colossal losses. Yet, from this new strategic perch, Guderian perceived a threat far more dangerous than production shortfalls, a fundamental flaw in German grand strategy, personified by Adolf Hitler himself. The Führer had become pathologically obsessed with holding every inch of conquered territory. His infamous Halte Befehl, stand fast orders, had transformed the Eastern Front into a voracious meat grinder for the Wehrmacht. Entire cities were declared fortresses to be defended to the last man, sacrificing veteran divisions in battles of attrition that perfectly suited Soviet strategy. Throughout 1943, Guderian leveraged his position to deliver a series of stark, data-driven, and increasingly urgent warnings. He was not a courtier, he was a technician of war, and his arguments were built on an unassailable foundation of cold, hard facts. He presented Hitler with detailed intelligence briefings that laid bare the staggering output of Soviet industry, which now dwarfed German production. He argued passionately for a strategic shift to a flexible, elastic defense. He pleaded for the creation of a powerful central operational reserve, a Feuerwehr, or fire brigade, of panzer divisions that could be rapidly deployed to blunt and counter Soviet breakthroughs, rather than having Germany's armoured strength scattered piecemeal along a massively overextended front. His most specific and dire warning focused on the precarious situation of Army Group Center in the spring of 1944. This massive formation occupied an enormous, vulnerable salient, a giant bulge jutting deep into Soviet territory, its flanks dangerously exposed. Guderian, analyzing the situation maps with a professional's discerning eye, recognized it as a perfect killing ground. He warned Hitler repeatedly that the Soviets would not attack in the south, as the Führer stubbornly believed, but would instead launch their main summer offensive directly against this salient, with the strategic objective of nothing less than the complete encirclement and annihilation of Army Group Center. He begged for authorization to shorten the line, to conduct a strategic withdrawal from the exposed positions, to create a denser, more defensible front. But these rational military assessments shattered against the wall of Hitler's ideological and psychological delusions. The dictator, increasingly isolated from reality, operated on a different plane of logic. For him, willpower could overcome any material disadvantage. To retreat was an admission of weakness, a betrayal of the political prestige he had gained in the occupied eastern lands. He was enveloped by sycophants in the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW, men like Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel and General Alfred Jodl, who reinforced his fantasies and dismissed the defeatist cautions of frontline commanders like Guderian. Hitler became captivated by Wunderwaffen, wonder weapons, like the Me-262 jet fighter, believing they would magically reverse the tide, making any strategic withdrawal unnecessary. Guderian, the realist, spoke the language of mathematics and logistics. Hitler, the ideologue, listened only to the siren song of dogma and destiny. A catastrophic confrontation was not just likely, it was inevitable. The arena for this climactic confrontation was Adolf Hitler's headquarters, the Wolf's Lair, a claustrophobic, damp complex of concrete bunkers buried deep in the East Prussian forest. It was a place shrouded in perpetual twilight, its air thick with the smells of damp concrete, diesel generators, and pervasive fear. Here, in the starkly lit map room, the fates of armies were decided based on the intuition and rage of a single, deteriorating man. This environment was engineered to insulate Hitler from unpleasant realities, creating an echo chamber where dissent was equated with treachery and strategic necessity was a sign of moral failing. Throughout the first half of 1944, Heinz Guderian became a recurring and increasingly despised figure in this oppressive sanctum. The confrontations between the Panzer general and the Nazi dictator became theatre of the absurd, characterized by their blistering intensity and profound futility. Guderian, a physically imposing man known for his volcanic temper, would stand before the large situation map, his finger jabbing at the vulnerable bulge of Army Group Center. His demeanor was brutally direct, devoid of the subtle flattery and political maneuvering that defined the Wolf's Lair's courtiers. He communicated in the vernacular of operational art, force ratios, logistical constraints, and enemy capabilities. A pivotal conference in late May 1944 serves as a perfect microcosm of the entire tragic dynamic. Guderian arrived armed with detailed aerial reconnaissance imagery and decrypted intelligence summaries, all pointing unequivocally to a massive Soviet buildup targeting the flanks of Army Group Center. He identified the precise assembly areas, the forests around Vitebsk, the swamps near Bobruisk. "The intelligence is incontrovertible, mein Führer," Guderian stated, his voice a low rumble of contained urgency. "They have concentrated over 160 divisions for a single purpose, the encirclement and destruction of Army Group Center. We have a narrow window to withdraw to the Panther-Votan line, shorten our front by hundreds of kilometers, and create a powerful operational reserve from the liberated divisions. If we remain static, we are inviting a disaster that will dwarf Stalingrad." Hitler's response was a masterpiece of denial and deflection. He would often spring from his chair, his body vibrating with nervous energy, and pace behind the massive oak table, his eyes flashing. "Guderian!" he would shriek, his voice rising to a piercing falsetto. "You are hypnotized by these reports. You and your general staff have always lacked the necessary hardness, the National Socialist fanaticism. I have a different intuition. The main blow will fall in the south against Modell's army group. This is a feint, a crude deception. And even if they are so foolish as to attack our center, we will grind them to dust against our fortified positions. We have the new Panther tank, the invincible Tiger. Let them break their teeth on our defenses. This will be a battle of annihilation, but it will be their annihilation." This was the heart of the disconnect. Guderian was fighting a war of maneuver on a topographical map, while Hitler was fighting a war of willpower on a psychological landscape. The atmosphere in these conferences was suffocating. Guderian was not arguing in a vacuum, he was performing before a captive audience of sycophants who watched this duel with a mixture of terror and servile agreement. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, the obsequious head of the OKW, would inevitably chime in the moment Hitler paused for breath. "The Führer's assessment is strategically brilliant," Keitel would affirm, nodding obsequiously. "To speak of withdrawal is to poison the morale of the brave soldiers holding the line. We must stand firm and have faith in the Führer's unerring instinct." General Alfred Jodl, the chief of operations, would then provide a veneer of intellectual justification, using cherry-picked intelligence to support Hitler's preconceived notions. "Our signals intelligence in Ukraine does suggest heightened radio traffic, mein Führer." General Guderian's caution, while militarily sound in a vacuum, may be underestimating the threat to our southern flank. Guderian stood alone, an island of reality in a sea of delusion. The arguments would spiral for hours, a vortex of repetitive, circular logic. Guderian would present more data, more photographs, more frontline assessments. Hitler would counter with grand historical analogies to Frederick the Great, accusations of cowardice, and tirades about the spirit of Zossen, a reference to the alleged defeatism of the old general staff. The physical and psychological toll on Guderian was immense. He would emerge from these sessions drenched in sweat, his uniform clinging to him, his blood pressure soaring to dangerous levels. He confessed to his chief of staff that these confrontations left him physically ill for days. He was a patriot, witnessing his nation being driven off a cliff, while the man at the wheel was not only ignoring his warnings, but was accusing him of sabotaging the vehicle. By mid-June 1944, the final, fatal decision was made. Hitler, convinced of his own strategic infallibility, ordered the critical panzer reserves, the 12th, 18th and 20th Divisions, transferred from the centre to the southern front. Guderian's final desperate objection was met with a glacial stare and a dismissive wave. The door to reason was now locked and bolted. The trap, meticulously prepared by the Soviets and left unsprung by German folly, was now ready to be sprung. On June 22, 1944, a date steeped in bitter irony for the German invaders, the Soviet Union unleashed Operation Bagration. The offensive began not in the south, but with apocalyptic force precisely where Heinz Guderian had foretold, against the gutted lines of Army Group Center. What followed was not a battle, it was a systematic dismemberment. The Soviet forces, employing deep battle doctrine with a sophistication that mirrored Guderian's own early campaigns, achieved a level of operational artistry that devastated the Wehrmacht. They pulverized the German front, bypassed strongpoints, and executed multiple, simultaneous encirclements. With its panzer reserves hundreds of kilometers away and its infantry divisions stretched to the breaking point, Army Group Center was not just defeated, it was eviscerated. German formations were severed, surrounded, and methodically annihilated. The roads leading west became avenues of horror, choked with desperate fleeing soldiers, mercilessly hunted by Soviet ground attack aircraft and partisan ambushes. In less than 2 months, one of Germany's most powerful army groups had been erased from the order of battle. The numbers were mind-numbing. Between 300,000 and 400,000 German soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Nearly 30 divisions ceased to exist. This was, as Guderian had prophesied with chilling accuracy, a catastrophe that eclipsed Stalingrad in its scale and strategic impact. For Heinz Guderian, this was the most hollow of victories. The "I told you so" was a phantom comfort, drowned in the river of blood that had once been an army. He labored relentlessly at his desk in the OKH headquarters, a man trying to build a dam against a flood with nothing but paperwork. He scrambled to find any available unit, a training battalion, a security company, anything, to throw into the yawning gaps in the front. But it was a futile exercise in desperation. The disaster was total, and it had been entirely preventable. Every dispatch reporting a corps lost, every city surrendered, was a grim testament to the precision of his warnings and the catastrophic folly of their rejection. The Eastern Front had been irrevocably broken, and the road to Germany now lay open. Then, on July 20th, 1944, a bomb detonated in the Wolf's Lair. The assassination attempt by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg failed to kill Hitler, but it succeeded in murdering the last vestiges of trust within the German High Command. For Guderian, the plot's aftermath was a personal and professional calamity. The failed coup triggered a witch hunt of hysterical proportions. Hitler, now certain that treachery festered within the heart of the Prussian officer corps, interpreted any dissenting military advice as potential evidence of treason. The general who had been ignored was now scrutinized as a possible conspirator. The atmosphere curdled into one of pure paranoia. Military conferences degenerated into loyalty tests. Guderian's blunt, factual style was now viewed not merely as insubordination, but as a marker of latent disloyalty. It was in this poisonous climate that Hitler made a supremely cynical move. In the frantic purge that followed July 20th, he appointed Heinz Guderian as the new chief of the General Staff. Superficially, it was the apogee of a military career, the highest office in the German army. In reality, it was a gilded cage, a cruel joke. Hitler had long ago eviscerated the authority of the General Staff, centralizing all military decision-making in his own hands and those of his OKW lackeys. Guderian's role was not to advise or command, it was to legitimize and implement the Führer's increasingly fantastical orders. He was transformed into a chief clerk for a disintegrating empire, forced to affix his signature to operational plans he knew were militarily insane. His promotion was not an empowerment, it was the final, systematic neutralization of his influence. He was the voice of reason, given a title that ensured his warnings would be formally recorded and systematically dismissed. In this impossible role, Guderian fought his last, hopeless battles. He was tangentially involved in the planning for the Ardennes offensive in December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge, a massive gamble that incinerated Germany's last strategic reserves in the West for zero strategic gain. His primary focus, however, remained the collapsing Eastern Front, where the Soviet steamroller was now advancing on the very borders of the Reich. In early 1945, with the Soviets massed on the Oder River, a mere 50 miles from Berlin, Guderian engaged in his final, furious confrontations with Hitler. He pleaded, he argued, he demanded that divisions be transferred from the quiet Western Front to defend the capital. The scenes in the Führerbunker became increasingly surreal and violent. At a stormy conference on March 28, 1945, Guderian presented the hopeless situation, insisting on reinforcements for the Oder front. Hitler, in a near-paralytic state of denial, refused, ranting about non-existent armies and mythical counter-offensives in Hungary. The argument exploded into a screaming match, with Hitler, his face contorted with rage, accusing his chief of staff of being a defeatist and a traitor. Physically drained, morally bankrupt, and seeing the absolute futility of his position, Heinz Guderian reached his end. He stood before the architect of Germany's ruin and delivered his final words as a soldier. "The situation is irredeemable. I can no longer fulfill my duties. You must relieve me of my command." On March 28, 1945, with the Reich crumbling around him, Heinz Guderian was dismissed. The general who had seen the truth was placed on indefinite leave. The voice in the wilderness was finally silenced, but by then, the wilderness was all that remained. The collapse he had striven so desperately to avert was now complete and utter. The final collapse of the Third Reich in May 1945 saw Heinz Guderian surrender to American forces. He was interrogated extensively and held as a prisoner of war until 1948. In the post-war Nuremberg trials, while many of his contemporaries faced judgment for war crimes, Guderian was not indicted. The Allied prosecutors viewed him primarily as a career soldier, a brilliant military technocrat rather than a key participant in the Nazi regime's criminal conspiracies. His final years were dedicated to writing his memoirs, Panzer Leader, a seminal work that provides a gripping, if decidedly one-sided, account of his experiences. The book became a foundational text for the early historical understanding of the war from the German perspective, serving as his ultimate testament and a detailed chronicle of his frustrated struggle against a leadership intoxicated by delusion. The story of Heinz Guderian stands as one of history's most compelling and tragic case studies on the cataclysmic price of ignoring expertise. He was the quintessential technocrat, a master of the science of warfare who found himself utterly powerless before the forces of ideology, megalomania, and sheer madness. His personal tragedy was one of prescience. With a clarity that eluded most of his peers, he accurately diagnosed the fatal illnesses within German strategy, prescribed the necessary, if bitter, remedies, and was dismissed not because his analysis was flawed, but because it was politically inconvenient. The vaporization of Army Group Center in the summer of 1944 stands as a permanent monument to this failure of command, a disaster that was not merely predicted, but was actively enabled by the rejection of professional counsel. His legacy remains profoundly dualistic, a subject of enduring historical debate. On one hand, he is rightly immortalized as the father of the Panzer Forces, a military revolutionary whose theories of mobile, combined arms warfare fundamentally altered the character of modern combat. His concepts of the Schwerpunkt and deep penetration remain cornerstones of military doctrine in academies worldwide. On the other hand, he was a willing servant of a genocidal regime. While not a Nazi ideologue himself, he was a loyal German officer who, until the very end, operated within the system's confines, believing that professional excellence could somehow mitigate the overarching moral and strategic bankruptcy of the cause he served. This dichotomy renders him a complex and contentious figure, a genius whose monumental talents were ultimately placed in the service of a criminal enterprise. The ultimate timeless lesson of Heinz Guderian's career transcends tanks and tactics. It is a perpetual warning about the existential danger that arises when leaders encase themselves in bubbles of sycophancy, when dogma overwhelms data, and when inflexible belief supplants adaptable, evidence-based strategy. He was the prophet who could decipher the maps of the future with uncanny accuracy, yet his warnings were smothered by the cacophony of a dictator's delusions. In the final analysis, the saga of the General Hitler refused to hear is more than a mere historical episode. It is a stark, enduring allegory for any institution, any government, any power structure that prizes unwavering conviction over critical competence and ideological purity over objective reality. His story echoes through the corridors of history as a solemn reminder that when the voices of reason are silenced, the only sound that remains is the deafening roar of absolute ruin.